Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by Congressional reporter Kate Scanlon. Kate, there was a long-awaited primary result we got this week that really people knew it was coming, but still I think to a lot of people the margin for Liz Cheney's defeat was pretty jarring, and obviously it raised a lot of questions about the Republican Party going forward. Talk a little bit about that race and what we'll see in Wyoming afterward.
So this was kind of the biggest test case for Donald Trump and his quest for revenge against the Republicans who voted to impeach him.
The impeachment revenge tour.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And Liz Cheney was the most vocal of that bunch. Obviously, she's also the vice chairwoman of the committee investigating the events surrounding January 6th. So that was a defeat Donald Trump had sought for a long time, backed her primary opponent, Harriet Hagman, and that bid was successful. Harriet Hagman defeated Liz Cheney, and that would have been maybe even a bigger deal just a cycle or two ago, but we've seen so many of these impeachment 10 either not seek re-election or lose their primaries. There's only 2 of them left that are going to be competing in the general election in November. So it's just perhaps the most fascinating case study.
Liz Cheney lost by 37 points.
She did.
Most of the pro-impeachment Republicans have lost. I think there's only been 2 exceptions so far.
2.
But Peter Meyer, for example,
Yes.
it was a 52-48 race, even with Democrats putting in a lot of money,
Yes.
in addition to the Trump endorsement of the other candidate. This was a pretty lopsided vote.
This was, and part of the reason for that is that Liz Cheney really leaned into it in a way that some of the others didn't. Peter Meyer, for example, they didn't necessarily shy away from it, but it wasn't necessarily their entire pitch to voters the way Liz Cheney really decided to die on this hill. And so it is just kind of an interesting juxtaposition of factors that led to such a broad defeat.
I mean, even when her father, the former Vice President Dick Cheney, a major figure in Wyoming politics for decades, held that House seat himself, cut an ad for his daughter, he didn't really emphasize his and her conservative credentials. His ad was also very heavily focused on Trump.
It was, and I think you had a lot of people who were labeling Liz Cheney as liberal or as a Democrat because she has these viewpoints on the former president. But if you look at her actual voting record, it is very conservative.
Right.
And that kind of got lost in a lot of the discussions about this race because people associated her with the one thing.
I mean, a lot of people were mentioning that she'd voted 93% of the time with Trump while she was serving in the House when he was president. At the same time, Trump got almost 70% of the vote in Wyoming. It was his best state in 2020.
It is. It's a very pro-Trump state, and so it was tough to make that sell to voters and be successful. But she seemed at peace with it in her concession speech. She said, winning this primary would have required me to embrace his lies about the election, and that's a path I wouldn't go down.
Now, speaking of some paths we didn't think anybody was ever going to go down, or didn't at least look like this for about a year, is we've been talking for a long time about reconciliation. The reconciliation process, primarily in the Senate, is a way to get around Republican filibusters, pass spending bills, tax bills. Democrats had wanted to pursue a lot of their agenda through a second big spending bill passed by reconciliation. Didn't look like it was going to happen. Didn't look like Joe Manchin in particular was going to let it happen. Lo and behold, it happened.
It did, and that again comes down to Joe Manchin. He basically said, here's what I'm willing to support, negotiated that with Chuck Schumer, and then kind of surprised everybody this summer by rolling out the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a scaled back version of Build Back Better. It's a smaller price tag. There's some substance changes that were cut from the original version that most Democrats wanted. But they took it, and it handed the president a pretty significant legislative victory in their final window of opportunity to do so before November.
And maybe it's because it was the final window of opportunity before November, but there are a lot of provisions that were missing from the bill that you could have easily seen centrists balking at in earlier iterations, or the progressives saying, this isn't good enough. But they kept everybody together this time.
They did, and I think last year you saw a situation where a lot of Democrats would rather have nothing than something, and
Right.
this time around they would rather have something than nothing. And so they were able to get it over the finish line, and President Biden signed it.
And they're clearly going to run on this in the midterms. It's become a big part of Democratic messaging
Yes.
ever since Biden signed it into law. But another big issue in the midterms is going to be the reversal of Roe versus Wade through the Dobbs decision that was handed down this summer. And Democrats in particular are trying to really use this to counteract what might have been a Republican red wave. But you've talked to a Democrat in your reporting who takes a very different position than the national party on this issue.
Yes, there's a Democrat in North Dakota, Mark Hagan, who's running for Congress for the at-large seat there. And that's a very deep red state, and he's
Right.
got very difficult odds to be elected to Congress. But the interesting thing about him and his candidacy is that in a time when so many Democrats nationally are running on the issue of abortion access,
Right.
he's pro-life.
Right.
He works at a school called the University of Mary, which is a very Catholic school there in North Dakota. And you know, he said he's been pro-life his entire career and isn't going to change his views on that, and wants to go into Congress as more of a centrist who's going to work across the aisle. Whether he can pull that off obviously remains to be seen, but it is an interesting outlier to the national trend.
It's really been a pretty dramatic shift. I mean, the Hyde Amendment originally passed in a Democratic-controlled Congress, banning taxpayer funding of most abortion at the federal level. So, at that time there was a large number of pro-life Democrats in Congress. Abortion wasn't as partisan of an issue as it is now. Now we're down to maybe one pro-life Democrat in the House.
One, Henry Cuellar, is the last one. We most recently saw a very dramatic, close primary defeat for Dan Lipinski,
Right.
who is perhaps like the most well-known pro-life Democrat left in Congress. And even just, even in my lifetime, there used to be more, but they just keep cycling out. And North Dakota is obviously a little bit different than the Illinois district where Dan Lipinski was, or the Texas district where Henry Cuellar is, in that it is such a deep red at-large seat.
Right.
But it is interesting, should he be successful in this bid that's kind of a long shot, he would be, the number of pro-life Democrats in Congress would essentially double
Right.
if he pulls this off. That's how few and far between they are now.
I mean, even as recently as when Barack Obama was president, the passage of Obamacare hinged on the support of a number of pro-life, mainly Catholic but not exclusively Catholic Democrats in the House.
Absolutely. And that's just, we've seen that just decrease and decrease and decrease each cycle. And now, especially with the Dobbs decision, as Democrats nationally really lean into this issue, it gets harder and harder for the few remaining Democrats to kind of get the support and the resources and stuff from the national party. But what was interesting in North Dakota is the state party there did choose to continue to support him, knowing that he was pro-life and didn't necessarily agree with them on this issue. There was a rejection of the idea that this should be a litmus test, which we've seen other Democrats in other states embrace that litmus test. So it is still an interesting thing being ironed out within the party.
So he's a chance to be the life of the party. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
You can read Kate and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.